SYN attacks, they've been around forever. SYN attacks basically work by filling up the connection buffer on a host. Every time you establish a three-way handshake with a host, you send out a SYN, and the accepting machine, the server machine, will listen and hear that SYN and allocate a place in memory for this oncoming communication. It hears a SYN and figures, someone's trying to talk to me, so I'm going to open up a spot in memory and I'm going to respond. Well, it will respond, and hopefully seconds later or milliseconds later, an acknowledgement will come back, and that will be the end of the three-way handshake, and that communication will exist. It will commence. Well, what the SYN attack is it's only the first part of that equation. The SYN goes out and sends its packet to the target computer, which hears it and allocates that space in memory, but then there is no response to the server's SYN-ACK. In other words, it will allocate the area in memory and respond with a SYN-ACK, but that SYN-ACK goes nowhere, it just dies. And if many of these connections start, the server will allocate more and more areas of memory and wait, and it typically waits a specified amount of time, which can be quite long. It could be a minute or two. So if it's waiting a minute and it keeps receiving thousands of SYNs a second, it's allocating more and more memory, and no one is ever responding, it'll just keep infinitely filling its buffers with memory for communications that are never going to happen. Some of the tools that you might use for this are SYNFlood, Synful, Tribal Flood, that's another one, Network 2000, these are some of the big names. We've also mentioned Sync4 there as another one. Let's take a look at it. So here's a normal TCP three-way handshake. This is what happens. The client sends a SYN, the server responds with a SYN-ACK, and the client finally sends the third part of the three-way handshake, the ACK back, and now they are all caught up. Their three-way hand shook, if you will, and they start talking. Well, this is what happens in a SYN attack. The SYN goes out, and it either is to a spoofed address or back to the target that is just not going to respond. The computer allocates the memory, the server allocates the memory, and waits and sends out the SYN-ACK. Now the SYN-ACK goes nowhere. It goes nowhere, and as the SYN-ACK is going back and the memory is being allocated, more and more SYNs start coming, and on it goes until there's thousands per second, and that can equate to megs and megs and megs of memory. So how do you defend against it? Well, you can certainly filter for this type of thing on the perimeter, filter SYNs. There are some firewalls that will actually what we call spot an ACK. They will send immediately a SYN-ACK back to any machine that sends it out. Now the original SYN will pass through the firewall and hit the server, but the SYN-ACK will be received by the firewall on its way back out of the network, and it will the firewall will then respond with an ACK, so at least that computer, that server computer, can take that area out of its buffer. Now, that SYN-ACK that went out through the firewall may never come back, and the firewall will keep track of that, but at least the server computer that heard the initial SYN and responded with the SYN-ACK will get an immediate ACK back to stop it and take that communication out of the buffer. That's one method of fighting that. If you don't just filter it, you can use a firewall that's clever enough to assist a server in this situation. You can also increase the connection queue. That's the buffer space that the computer uses to allocate. You can employ things like traffic shaping tools, which will affect how the SYN-ACK exchange occurs and how much bandwidth to allocate to such a task. If 1,000 SYNs per second can't get through the firewall, then it's not really a problem. If only 10 per second can get in, well, not that much memory is going to get allocated by the time those timeouts occur and the memory gets deallocated. Another tool you can use is SYN cookies. Basically, a SYN cookie splits TCP up into two separate processes. The server will receive the SYN and then immediately just hand it over to some other process to send out a SYN-ACK. And it won't really pay attention to it. It'll just sit there accepting normal SYNs, and it will hand off the management of this to another process. And it will look at the sequence numbers of the returning packets to determine whether it should continue this conversation or not. Here's a SYN packet. There's the SYN-ACK ISN, and that has the hashed response. Now normally this sequence number that's sent back in the SYN-ACK from the server has the IP address and the port number hashed into the ISN, into the actual sequence number that it sends back in its ACK, in its SYN-ACK. It will be hashed in some way that it will only respond, it will only allocate memory to those packets that come back with the proper acknowledgement of that hashed initial sequence number. So this is a sort of a non-connection oriented way of looking at a connection-oriented protocol. It splits the protocol up into two processes, one that manages these hashed SYN cookies, as we'll say, and one that just accepts incoming SYN packets. Finally, if the computer responds with an ACK and that particular acknowledgement is that SYN cookie plus one, we know that's a legitimate connection and we'll allocate the resources and continue talking.